it used to be said that if you take LSD 3 times, you are by definition clinically insane. That was probably a kind of rumour started by the US government, no doubt. Here's some classic Huichol, they call themselves Huichol, artworks, very geometric, very colourful. Here's some more kind of typical Huichol artwork. Here's not so typical, they're not really going around selling VWs. Hi, I'm Dr. David Luke, and I'm here with Funzing for London Talks Tonight, and I'm talking tonight about psychedelics, the science of, and exceptional human experience, which is a whistle-stop tour through the science of extraordinary phenomena that people have under the influence of potent mind-hacking chemicals like LSD, DMT and psilocybin. And just to give you a super good factoid on that, these things have been known about for about 100 years in the West and the academy, and yet they've been prohibited from research use for the last 50 years until very recently. So we're in the middle of a psychedelic renaissance right now. So come and join me at Funzing. There are increasingly more and more known psychedelic substances that we're coming across. The number of psychedelics increases by a factor of 10 every 50 years. I've been a good drug geek. I tried to work out, well, how many psychedelic substances are there that we know about? And there's a kind of a secret formula which goes along with it, which is that in the year 1900, we pretty much only knew about 2 psychedelic substances. By the year 2000, we've got 200 different psychedelics, and so it's probably even more now. And so we're on course with this exponential increase. It's kind of increasingly increasing. And so by 2050, there'll be something like 2,000 different psychedelic substances. By the year 2100, there'll be 20,000 different psychedelic substances, and so on. And so we've passed the tipping point where you can take one of these every day of the year and take them all in one year. So it's only going to get weirder from here on in. Now we're going to move on to the neuroscience. And so what do we know about what happens in the human brain when you give somebody a psychedelic? Well, we didn't know very much until a few years ago, despite the fact that brain imaging technology has been advancing for decades now. Because of Prohibition, which happened in the late 1960s, there's been this kind of 50-year hiatus of research with psychedelics, because when Prohibition happened in the 60s, it didn't really stop people taking psychedelics, because actually the number of people taking psychedelics has steadily increased, the number of drugs available has increased, the purity has increased, and the price has gone down. So more people are taking psychedelics year on year, and all drugs, in fact, since Prohibition. So Prohibition didn't really work at stopping people taking drugs. It had the opposite effect, if anything. But it did stop scientists like myself doing research with psychedelics for about 50 years. And so it's only recently we've actually gone, ooh, let's peer inside the human brain and see what's going on in there when you give someone a psychedelic. But before that happened, if you'd kind of asked any neuroscientist worth their fantastically large brain imaging grants, what happens in the human brain when you give someone a psychedelic, they'd all go, oh, this part of your brain lights up, or this part of your brain has more activity. They would all agree that there was an increase in activity somewhere in your brain when you give someone a psychedelic, because you have this increase in kind of sensory experience. Everything's kind of colourful and overwhelming and just kind of big, like, oh wow. And so that kind of oh wow thing should be related to kind of more activity in the brain. So the big surprise was they actually looked at people's brains in an fMRI scanner, in this case on psilocybin. So the areas on this graph in red indicate an increase in activity. There aren't any. And the areas in blue indicate a decrease in activity. So what we actually found, there was no area of the brain which had an increase in activity whatsoever, and there were certain key regions which actually the activity went down. And that was a massive surprise. And those key regions are what's known as the default mode network, which is basically associated with your kind of ego and your ego control. So when you turn that down in your brain, you have this kind of intense, overwhelming, sensory, multicoloured, extra-dimensional experience called tripping. So they looked at it in a slightly different way because they weren't very satisfied with that. And so they reanalyzed the data in a different way. And so they looked at it in terms of the amount of interconnectivity between different regions of the brain. And so these kind of little circles around the edge represent different regions of your brain, and the lines in between represent the amount of communication between those different regions. That's your brain not on drugs. And then the one on the right is your brain on psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms. And the first thing you probably notice is it doesn't look like a fried egg, which was a big surprise, because for years we've been led to believe that, you know, your brain looks like a fried egg on drugs. And but the next thing you notice is there's this kind of massive amount of interconnectivity between different regions of the brain that previously weren't communicating with each other. So, you know, suddenly your hippocampus starts up a conversation with your angular gyrus. Oh, hi, I'm the hippocampus. Oh, I've never chatted to you before. And so you've got all these different regions of the brain communicating. Now that seems a little bit incongruous with the previous slide where we show a decrease in activity. But so I'm just trying to kind of how we can marry up these two things. So there's a decrease in activity in key regions of the brain. There's no increase anywhere, but there's loads more interconnectivity as well. And that's kind of what's going on in your brain on psychedelics. Kind of. It's very simple, this neuroscience stuff, isn't it? I mean, who'd have thought it? Every year, approximately 0 people die from a psilocybin overdose. They have low dependency risks as well, so they're not addictive. Although I had a colleague who was giving a talk a bit like this to an audience, he was talking about ayahuasca, and somebody in the audience went, "But aren't these drugs addictive?" And he goes, "Oh no, they're not." And I would know because I've taken it thousands of times. Honestly, they're not addictive. And it can be used to treat people who have addictions to tobacco very successfully. Meanwhile, tobacco is legally available if you're over a certain age, kills hundreds of thousands of people every year, and doesn't help you get off your addiction to anything. So, you know, is there something a bit wrong with that? I can't quite get my head around it. I'm not sure. I think something's a bit strange about that. And so Lewis Williams and Dowson put forward this kind of a model to map the visionary experience of the altered state of consciousness, be it with psychedelics or other things. And they said it happens in 3 basic stages. So you go into an altered state. The first thing, stage 1, you see these geometric patterns. And then in stage 2, as the visions develop, you know, your kind of wiggly lines will suddenly turn into snakes. And then in the middle, you get sucked into a vortex and you out the other side, and there's a werewolf waiting for you in a suit. Pretty much standard, really. Happens every time if you go into an altered state. Or more or less, you know. So the idea of it is that the iconic forms take on a kind of mythological kind of character. So then the archaeologists got in on this as well, and they were kind of a bit theoryless in archaeology in trying to understand the earliest artwork of humans, like Upper Paleolithic rock art, which we find all over the world in caves and on rocks and things like that. But there was no one common theory as to explain what it actually meant, you know, what they're trying to depict. But these guys, Lewis Williams and Dowson, put forward this idea that, well, you see a lot of these geometric patterns in all of this rock art. They're not just doodles. These guys were clearly in some kind of altered state. And they kind of tried to establish that with some evidence, and they mapped all the different geometric patterns you get with different rock art from around the world and put forward a pretty good, you know, hypothesis. I can't imagine what inspires their artwork. Well, it's the peyote, obviously.
When you was doing taking part in the trials for psilocybin, I suspect you were taking like synthetic psilocybin.
Yeah, it was injected. It was a bit hard to get kind of real mushrooms at the syringe.
Yeah. So my question is, did it differ to your experiences on organic or natural mushrooms?
Okay, so in comparison of synthetic psilocybin with mushrooms. the experience with synthetic was, because it was injected, I think it was the mode of delivery was probably the most different. I don't think it was, I mean, Albert Hoffman, when he first synthesized psilocybin, he took it out to Mexico to the Mazatec shamaness Maria Sabina, and mushrooms were out of season, and he gave us some capsules of psilocybin, and she necked them and said, oh yeah, these are my little children, i.e. the kind of mushroom spirits, and she was quite happy to do a shamanic work with that. I don't think that the kind of experiential effects are very different. However, when it's injected in the synthetic form, you're basically peaking instantly. So, you know, if you take psilocybin mushrooms, it'll take about half an hour to come up steadily with kind of a bit of stomach ache and all the rest of it. And you inject it, 1 minute you're kind of straight, and then next minute, as happened to me, I was in a kind of brain imaging, and this time the MEG, and you're basically kind of strapped in with this cosmic perming device on your head, looking at a kind of monitor screen, and suddenly there's all these kind of lights kind of flashing through the room like this, and then it went from looking at this monitor screen to I'm in my childhood living room looking at the fireplace to I'm inside an Aztec temple looking at the altar to I'm back in the brain scanner again, you know, very, very quickly, within a few seconds. So yeah, it's much more of an intense onset, but essentially like psilocybin. Yeah.
Do you think the psychedelic culture sparked by the legalization of cannabis is where we're headed, and do you think that's probably where we're going to get this kind of dissolution of mass power?
Are we going to find dissolution of kind of hierarchical systems or whatever? I mean, possibly. I mean, that was the fear in the 60s from the powers that be, and that's why psychedelics were made legal. I mean, they kind of invented various spurious medical reasons for why psychedelics were dangerous. You know, like you take it 3 times and you're clinically insane, so on and so forth. But it was more politically motivated, the prohibition of psychedelics in the 60s, because a lot of people were taking them in the so-called counterculture. But you know, I don't know why it's called the counterculture anyway, because these are kind of people who didn't want to bomb the shit out of kind of foreign countries and people living there. You know, they wanted peace and harmony. Why that's counterculture and not the culture is mind-boggling in itself.
It's nice to experience and learn useful things, but it was given in a really exciting way. So the guy that just did it was really fun. I can't remember his name, but yeah, it was really, really good. And I've been to one the other week as well about dreams, which is also really interesting. Recommended, totally.